Okay, so today our theme is Jung, Astrology and Modernity, three rather large topics, and I'm going to talk about how those three topics interrelate and how they fit into my wider PhD studies. So here's our programme for today. So I'm going to briefly introduce Jung, although I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the figure of Carl Jung. Then I'm going to talk about the context for these three subjects, my PhD studies, what that is actually about. And some of the themes we'll be briefly considering are the profound relationship between psychology and modernity, the modernising zeal in 20th century astrological texts, and Jung's place within modernity. And then I'll be concluding. So, here we have, who was Carl Gustav Jung? So, 1875 to 1961. So before we get on to more of the factual details of his life, here's a quote from Sonu Shandasani, one of the premier contemporary scholars in Jung's contribution to early dynamic psychiatry and psychology. So, I won't read all this out, but we can see from this quote quite a controversial figure and still being reassessed in terms of who he was and what is his contribution. So, occultist but also scientist, philosopher, Gnostic, postmodernist, interesting for us today, Gnostic, psychiatrist, anti-psychiatrist, so a whole range of views about who this guy was and what is his contribution and how he fitted in. So, some more factual details. So, born in Switzerland, 1875, eventually decided on a medical training, although he was very interested in archaeology and many of the arts subjects, but decided to specialise in medicine and then psychiatry. Very important in the formation of psychoanalysis, so not just as a sort of sidekick to Freud, which is sometimes thought of that as his contribution. No, important in his own right, important work on the early development of schizophrenia, and his association test work actually eventually led to the formation of the lie detector in the US. Met Freud in 1907 and had the infamous break with Freud in 1913. His psychology is generally known as analytical psychology, although he did try to rename it at one point as complex psychology, and his aim, according at least to Shandasani, was to establish a general psychology, so not just a psychology of pathologies, but actually a general psychology for human beings. So 1913, precipitated in part by that break with Freud, he went into his encounter with the unconscious, a period of several years where he explored his own inner images, he dialogued with inner figures, his dreams, and he went through a period of searching. And this eventually became the period underlying the Red Book, which has been published in recent years, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. 1928 discovered alchemy, which became very important in his later thinking. And 1961 he died after a short illness, so just a few points there. Now we know Jung enjoyed astrology, studied astrology, used astrology, thought about it for a very long time. Our earliest reference, as far as I know, is the letter to Freud of the 12th of June 1911, in which he writes, "My evenings are largely taken up with astrology. I make horoscopic calculations in order to find a clue to the core of psychological truth." So certainly studying it around 1911, perhaps before as well. So therefore, a dual influence on subsequent astrology, firstly through his own interest and work with astrology that has been cited by astrologers as evidence of validation or approval, so there's a general point about his own interest in astrology, but also his own ideas being applied to horoscopic interpretations, such as ideas of typology, his four functions being applied to the four elements, archetypes, individuation, this idea that we're all on a journey of growth, and synchronicity as well. So broadly, the idea that there are meaningful acausal coincidences. Or no, well, coincidence, wrong word. But so his influence has already been noted by historians of modern astrology, such as Nick Campion and Patrick Curry. So Nick describes Jung as seminal influence, and Patrick has the strongest influence on the form of psychology known as psychological astrology, albeit sometimes indirect. So the wider context of this topic today, this talk today, is my ongoing PhD studies, and the title of that is The Psychologization of Western Astrology in the 20th Century. So it's applying to the English-speaking world, and I'm examining primary text of those astrologers who have already been identified by other scholars as important in reforming in a kind of psychological way. So people like Alan Leo, Charles Carter, Dane Rudyard, Margaret Holmes, Stephen Aurio, Liz Green. I'm sure lots of you are very familiar with these astrologers. So I'll just say a little bit more about the definition of this title. So the form of astrology I'm looking at is a branch of judicial astrology, the judgments from horoscopes. Natal astrology is what I'm focusing on. And psychologization, for the purpose of today, is the modern tendency to manage non-psychological issues in the language of psychology. So I'm examining the claim that astrology has been psychologized in the 20th century, has become more psychological than previously. Okay. So now a little bit more on today's theme. So I'm looking at modernity and psychology really as quite intertwined concepts today, because following Peter Homans, who is himself following Peter Schills, and suggesting that modern life, by its very nature, is intensely psychological. So some of the characteristics of modernity being a loss of regard for tradition or authority, so there's this sense of sweeping away the past, in with the new. We need to get rid of old silliness and superstition. We need to reform everything on firm foundations. An increased awareness of individuality and the enlargement of inner space, perhaps going right back to the Cartesian split between inner and outer, and these quite grand bifurcations in modernity of subjective, objective, inner, outer. And also considering modernity as thought of by Walter Hanegraaff, the historian of Western esotericism, as the privileging of instrumental causality. So the view of the world that causal ways to finding truth is the main mode to truth in modernity, and the subjective or anything else is really very much on the fringes or not quite on the firm foundations that objective science and causally related things are. So I missed out there as well. So we've got this idea of psychological man, which goes back to Reef, a sociologist, as being the fundamental distinction between traditional Western culture and modernity. Now, psychology itself, as a formal science, only really got going very recently. According to Shamdasani, it was laid its foundations between 1870 and 1930. So, for example, we had the first chair in psychology as a science in 1892, which was Theodore Flerney in Geneva. And a quote here from Shamdasani: "At the outset, psychologists sought to emulate the form and formation of established prestigious sciences such as physics and chemistry." So there was a self-conscious will to form psychology as a science on this mould of those more, I wouldn't say traditional, but those sciences that had already got going by that period. So, hence, if we go to the start of the 20th century, we've got the rise of psychology as a science, and this is the context within which our modernising astrologers come into, the ones I'm looking at in the 20th century. So let's have a quick look at some examples from those said astrologers. First one, here we have Dane Rudyard's first book, and very important book, The Astrology of Personality, 1936, a key text, and already bringing in Jung's ideas and astrology. Dane Rudyard was very, very taken up with what he knew by the time of 1936 with Jung's thinking and ideas, very much impressed. And he weaved this into his thinking about astrology in his first book. He has a chapter in the book of astrology facing modern thought. So he's concerned with the fact that astrology is out of step, perhaps, with modernity. And he says his purpose in this book is to pave the way to a new type of astrology, and on the same page we're stressing the values and using the terminology which we found in Jung's works. Let's go ahead, a couple more decades, 1951, to Margaret Home's modern textbook of, I've got the wrong words there, but modern textbook of astrology, a classic in astrological education. This book was very influential. It became the textbook of the Faculty of Astrological Studies, and subsequently through that mechanism influenced a lot of astrologers who were training with the faculty or related courses. And in this book she says she equates this modern astrology that she's presenting with the need to integrate this psychological knowledge. So it's now realised that many happenings in I'm going to change it, person's life are concurrent with certain psychological states which spring from an inner motivation. And she also has Jungian terminology in the book, and a whole chapter near the end on depth psychology and Jung. So we've got the modernising project, again with references to Jung. Another one, 1970s now, 1975, Stephen Uri. Now he's still doing a new kind of astrology. New kind of astrology is being born at this time, and more than anyone else we can appeal to Jung's thought and some of his ideas to help us in this astrology. It's a paraphrase of that. Last example, 1978, Liz's second book, Liz Green. So astrology enjoying a popular renaissance, and it's now becoming a tool of immense power and the exploration of the human psyche. And the planets are symbols of the powers of the unconscious, which is a direct phrase from Jung. It was what he used in his 1954 letter to the astrologer Andrikopoulos. So very much equating this with Jungian language, and in fact in a much more explicit manner throughout that particular text relating. So where have we got to so far? We've got our modernising astrologers keen to present an astrology fit for modern times. Such an astrology requires psychology. Jung's is the most fruitful work in which to bring in ideas. So that leads to many questions perhaps, but one question, but what's the status of Jung's work in fact in relation to modernity? So that's what I want to look at now briefly. So Jung was, well clearly he was a psychologist. He came out of this formation of a new discipline. He was in that lineage, although in the psychoanalytic strand of that, but he and very concerned to be scientific or empirical, always maintaining that concern in his sort of published letters and writings. But he was also a big critic of the modern West, and he believed his work supplied what was lacking in Western life and the Western psyche. So different scholars, as always, have different views. Some would suggest that Jung is really not very connected with the modern world. He's not modern, he's just disguising his psychology, which is really traditional esotericism, and we'll look at a view in a moment from Walter Hanegraaff. Others, such as Shambhasani, Homan's Main, say that Jung was attempting to reconcile the ancient and the modern within the individual, so it's a bit more of a nuanced analysis. And we'll come to an example of that in a moment as well. So here's Walter Hanegraaff. So in his book New Age Religion and Western Culture, we've got Jung as a radical psychological interpreter of the macrocosmos, microcosmos doctrine, the medieval doctrines, though not very modern at all. The world of the psyche and external reality, two different reflections of the Uns Mundus, the one world, again not really connected with a materialist cosmology or a sort of modern instrumental causality view. And Hanegraaff asserts here that Jung just appeared to be scientific, but actually he was building his concept of science, of psychology, opposed to modern causality. Now I think this view is a little bit too broad brush, and it's in fact this chapter here that he talks about Jung is based on quite questionable sources, quite poor sources. So I think this is one can see where he's coming from, but doesn't tell perhaps the whole story. There's more to be said about Jung and modernity than that. So if we look at Roderick Mayne's view, so following Homans, as I've said, argues Jung's psychology attempts to integrate traditional and modern approaches. very critical of scientific rationalism and its one-sidedness. He felt that there was no space in the Western modern psyche for the irrational forces of the unconscious. And Main's book about this is about synchronicity and how this is a challenge to the very foundations of Western science, but through broadening the concept of science rather than rejecting it altogether. So it's not a rejection of causality, it's just saying that causality does not describe everything that human beings experience through their psyche, so it's not enough. And Jung's other challenge was this idea that fantasy thinking, what he called fantasy thinking, should have equal value to what he called directive thinking. So he had this idea that there were two types of thinking, one mythological and based on images, and one the direct logical thinking, and there needed to be a balance between those two for the psyche to be whole. So he says that synchronicity underpins Jung's radical critique of the scientism, soullessness and authoritarianism of modern Western culture as he perceived it. And he quotes Jung from Jung's interview with Mircea Eliade, saying that synchronicity resembles numinous experiences where space, time and causality are abolished, which certainly sounds quite radical, not so much on the modern side of these things really are abolished, but if you go back to the original interview, in that interview Jung is very much saying, I am and remain a psychologist. I'm not interested in anything that's transcending the psychological content of the experience. So even though the psyche may experience space-time and causality as being abolished, are they really? So he's back to his sort of more modern perspective, I think, in terms of I only report what I find in the psyche. I'm a psychologist, I'm an empiricist, I'm a scientist. More from Jung himself. So another example, 1958, so a contradictory example, at the Basel Psychology Club, saying that we've got irrefutable evidence that some other parts of our psyche are not subject to the laws of space and time. So not a very modern view, I would assert. So I'm rushing. Another letter, though, again going back to 1946, and giving a definition, an unusually clear definition for him of the collective unconscious, saying it's not, it doesn't behave always psychologically, and it's just the unknown thing in the world. So it's actually, the cases of synchronicity, it's a universal substrate present in the environment. So this is really going beyond the realm of the psychological, so not in tune with the modern cosmos. And his very last work, which was finished 10 days before he died, Approaching the Unconscious in 1961, he talks here about how modern people are different from previous people who were not aware of the experience of symbols. They just experienced them. But there is a difference for modern men and women because they are consciously reflecting on those symbols. So he's sort of going. Well, I'm saying he's going back here to be, modern people are different. I'm a reporter of the experience of the psyche, and there is a fundamental difference here in our relations to symbolism. So, a place in modernity for Jung. So a simple sort of presentation here. Maybe modern, well, he's only concerned with what happens in the human psyche. He's very keen to be a scientist, an empiricist, reluctant to draw out metaphysical implications and go beyond the psyche through much of his work, but there are a few little, anomalies there. And so it's a different relationship to symbols for modern people. So, genuinely trying to establish a psychology for modern people. But not very modern, sort of bringing back the psyche, the idea of the psyche as a reflection of the macrocosmos, the psychoid nature of reality, the dual meaning that the psyche and matter are really two halves of the same thing. It's all connected. Not very modern there. Very critical of Western rationalism, and also synchronicity, this problem about the possible abolition of space, time, and causality. So where does that leave our astrologers? Perhaps in a similar position to Jung's ambiguity. So often some of the 20th century astrologers are focusing quite extensively on what happens within the human psyche rather than broader conceptions or metaphysical conceptions. Not so sure about the concern with science, but perhaps a concern at least referring to psychology as a respectable discipline or an outside source of validation. But there is unevenness there, and there are philosophically, I don't think they're coming from a different place to previous, well, not all of them, but some of the previous astrologers, in terms of astrology being fundamentally connected with correspondences or sympatheia, which is not something that is part of the modern cosmology. So, here we go. So where does this leave us again? So astrologers like Rob Hands, back at the 2005 AA conference, in his lecture on Is Astrology Postmodern, was saying that we cannot have a modern astrology because of the philosophical problem with that. It just doesn't fit in to a materialist cosmology, it doesn't fit in to a causal sort of system, so it can't be modern. Another way of looking at it, Nick takes a broader view, saying that perhaps not looking at the sort of philosophical angle so much, but saying that astrology can be seen as a natural part of the modern world because modernity does include this diversification of religion and spirituality. So we can have an astrology, but looking at it in slightly different terms. So last slide. 20th century astrologers wished to modernise, lived at a time where psychology as a new science was gaining momentum. Psychology and preoccupation with the inner world, with inner life, is profoundly connected with modernity, with Jung's psychology in particular making an appeal. But Jung's modernity is ambiguous. But we could say that his reluctance to address metaphysical questions is thoroughly modern in particular, and that modern astrologers follow this ambiguity, or the ones I'm looking at, the 20th century examples. Their preoccupation with psychology is modern, despite modernity offering little philosophical support for astrology. So was then astrology psychologized? Well, it's an ongoing question. Probably say in some ways sort of lightly, but it's not as clear-cut as it may sometimes be presented to be. So that's the end of the talk.
What questions? Yes.
I'm really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask you, are you going to look at Roberto Saggioli, who was a great judge in Bermuda, and are you going to look at the astrology of Bruno and Louise Huber, who worked for several years with Saggioli?
The answer is possibly haven't decided yet. I mean, I haven't looked at them thus far, but obviously I'm aware of them as being there and having them.
Yeah. To do in the book I published this year was to actually look at psychological astrology and astrological psychology, and to explain to some extent how they went in diverse directions. So, you might or might not agree with some of my conclusions, but it is something I've been working on, and I would think that something which just said, Jung is here, and didn't look at the others. I mean, obviously I know that this green is what was always much more Colombian. I mean, I did attend, she very briefly was involved with Ian Gordon Brown and the transpersonal astrology. And in fact, we look at two models, the Jungian model and the Saggioli model together. And obviously, Ian preferred the Saggioli model.
Yeah, just to clarify, the wider PhD is not just about Jung. That was a sort of subset, just for the purpose of a short talk today.
Well, I think we'll have to.
Psychological astrology, using to take a look at astrological psychology.
Right.
Okay.
Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, the concept of archetypes in Jungian psychology, he was kind of defining, redefining. The concept was evolving Do you think that's really a problem when it comes to, matching astrology with psychology? Do you want to find, common symbols? The fact that he was constantly changing his concept, I think that's a difficulty. For instance, Daniel Rudier may have taken the earlier Jungian concepts and then they were evolving at the same time. So Jungian at the 50s might look different like Jungian at the 30s.
Yeah.
So is that an issue?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. So I guess people who were writing after Jung died and his works have been translated into English have a slightly, although still very difficult task of trying to assimilate what did he mean by the concept of archetype. They'd have to look at the evolution of that concept in all his writings, as you say, and then if they were so inclined to map that to astrology, would have to come up with some definitive
I was
idea.
some of the letters between Pauli and Jung, they were working together for the synchronistic, and even Pauli was complaining that the concept was evolving, and they worked together just for like 5 years or 3 years work. I mean, I think he was analyzed by Jung, but they were working closely.
Yeah, they wrote a book together, didn't they?
Yeah.
But I do think, Pauli did get a bit a bit worried by it.
I think Jung was reading astrology quite a lot sooner than you've given him credit for, because I think if you look at Memories, Dreams and Reflections, when he was 16, 17, 18, 19, when he was a teenager, he was reading at least the physical sources of astrology, and he talks about that, particularly the first bit of Memories, Dreams and Reflections, which was more autobiographical than the later.
It was, I'll check that out. I'll just say one thing about Memories, Dreams and Reflections is that it was written by his secretary with input from him, and there's some question over the authenticity. It's not, I don't think it's totally, the first part is more than the last,
The first part is meant to be much more by him. Finishing it.
And is there explicit reference of astrology? No. I'll have to read it again.
Not specific to astrology, but to some of the philosophical sources of astrology.
Okay. Yeah.
So he's. I'll send you.
Okay. Send me the page. Yeah. Thanks, Babs.
I was wondering if it would be fair to say that astrologers fastened on Jung to the extent they did, specifically Jung, because you've shown very clearly how ambiguous Jung is in relation to modernity, and astrology is ambiguous in relation to modernity, so he was like the perfect figure for them in a way.
Yeah.
And also it does, I don't know where I would take this thought, but the revival of so-called traditional astrology and the revival or appearance of so-called divinatory astrology, both very strongly anti-psychological. So I think you're right. That's sort of a fuzzy empirical confirmation of the idea of your suggestion that psychology really is distinctively modern. So when they wanted to reject a modern astrology and return to something regarded as pure, that was the first thing that had to go, with psychology, and with it went Jung. But of course that is to ignore Jung's non-modernity or even anti-modernity.
But Jeffrey says that Jung was a big influence on him. He refers to Jung in his Moment of Astrology. So Jung is still there as an influence, but in a different sense.
It is, but I don't think that necessarily the way it was taken up was in the same way that Jeffrey originally set it out. Yeah. Anyway, good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.